Marriage between siblings. What does the Bible reveal to us? Have you ever wondered how humanity began to multiply if Adam and Eve were the first and only humans? And more importantly, does the Bible really suggest marriages between siblings? This is a controversial topic that raises questions and often sparks judgment. But what if the answer is deeply tied to the customs, culture, and even God's plan for those early days? How did humanity begin with just one family? Have you ever wondered how the earliest generations of people lived, grew, and multiplied? It's a question that often sparks curiosity, debate, and even controversy. At the heart of this discussion lies a challenging concept: marriage among siblings. It's a topic that can be uncomfortable to confront, but one that's deeply rooted in the origins of the human story according to the Bible. Before we dive into the complexities of this issue, let's address the elephant in the room. For many of us, the idea of sibling relationships beyond the bounds of brotherhood or sisterhood feels inherently wrong. It conflicts with modern moral frameworks and cultural norms. But to truly understand the earliest days of humanity, we need to step outside our 21st century perspectives and explore a world far removed from our own. This video will take you on a journey back in time, to the very beginning, when humanity's foundations were laid by a single family, Adam, Eve, and their children. Together, we'll unpack the context of those early days, exploring what life was like, why sibling marriages were necessary, and how they fit into God's divine plan. By the end of this journey, you'll not only gain a new appreciation for the Bible's depth but also learn to approach ancient customs with greater understanding and less judgment. Our goal isn't just to explain the how of sibling marriage, but to answer the deeper why. Why was this necessary? What does it teach us about God's plan for humanity? And how can we use these lessons today to bridge gaps in understanding between faith, history, and modern life? If you've ever wrestled with questions about the Bible's historical accuracy or felt uneasy about parts of its narrative, this video is for you. We'll provide context and clarity to some of the most misunderstood and misinterpreted elements of Scripture. You'll leave this discussion not only informed but also inspired to look at biblical history with fresh eyes. The Bible begins its account of humanity with Adam and Eve, a couple uniquely created by God and placed in the Garden of Eden. From this point, we're introduced to their children, Cain, Abel, and later Seth. But anyone reading the Bible closely might pause and ask, wait a minute. If there were only a handful of people at the time, who did Cain marry? It's one of the Bible's great mysteries, and the answer often leads us back to an overlooked reality: Adam and Eve had many more children than the text explicitly names. The book of Genesis, while rich in spiritual truths, isn't a comprehensive historical document. It's selective in its storytelling, highlighting moments of theological importance rather than providing a play-by-play account of every detail. In Genesis 5 verse 4, we find a key clue: Adam lived 930 years and had other sons and daughters. These unnamed siblings are critical to understanding how humanity began to multiply and spread across the earth. Imagine the world at this time. It wasn't filled with bustling cities, governments, or social structures as we know them today. It was a raw and undeveloped landscape, where humanity was taking its first steps toward forming communities. In this context, the necessity of sibling marriages becomes apparent, not as an endorsement of what we would call incest today, but as a practical and unavoidable reality of the time. Without these unions, the human race could not have grown. To better grasp this, let's look at the cultural lens of the ancient world. Societies long ago viewed family and marriage differently than we do now. In many ancient cultures, including those influenced by biblical narratives, the idea of familial responsibility often extended far beyond what modern readers might imagine. The survival of the family unit was paramount, and preserving lineage was a primary goal. But the Bible isn't just about genealogies, it's also a theological narrative. Every event, every decision made by the first family, fits into God's overarching plan for humanity. These early chapters of Genesis teach us about beginnings, obedience, and consequences, all framed within the story of one family tasked with populating the earth. It's also worth noting how ancient interpreters of the Bible viewed these stories. For centuries, scholars and theologians have debated the nuances of Genesis, from the symbolic significance of Adam and Eve to the practical realities of their children's lives. Some Jewish and Christian traditions emphasize the divine perfection of Adam and Eve as a key reason sibling marriages were not seen as morally problematic in their time. This perspective aligns with the belief that humanity, in its earliest form, was untainted by the corruption that sin would later bring. While these interpretations help us understand the text, they also raise more profound questions. Why did God choose to begin humanity this way? Couldn't he have created more people simultaneously? These questions don't always have clear answers, but they invite us into the mystery of God's plans. As we examine these early stories, it's essential to keep their purpose in mind. Genesis wasn't written to satisfy our modern curiosity about genetics or anthropology. It was written to reveal God's character, his relationship with humanity, and his plan for redemption. Every detail, even those we struggle to understand, points back to these central themes. The history of the first family is about more than just who married whom or how many children Adam and Eve had. It's a story of beginnings, filled with lessons about trust, faith, and the enduring hope that God's plans are always bigger than our understanding. To understand why sibling marriages were acceptable in the earliest days of humanity, we must take a closer look at the unique circumstances of creation. In the beginning, Adam and Eve were created as the pinnacle of God's handiwork, formed in his image and described as very good, Genesis 1 verse 31. This phrase carries profound implications, not just about their spiritual connection to God but also about their physical and genetic makeup. Unlike humanity today, Adam and Eve were created without flaw. Their bodies were perfect, untouched by the effects of sin, decay, or genetic mutation. This perfection extended to their DNA, which would have been free from the harmful genetic defects that accumulate over generations. In this context, the risk of genetic abnormalities arising from sibling marriages was virtually non-existent. Let's break this down further. Today, genetic disorders often result from the pairing of similar recessive genes. These mutations accumulate over time, which is why modern societies discourage close relative marriages. However, in the pristine world of early creation, these genetic imperfections simply didn't exist. Adam and Eve's children would have inherited their near-perfect genetics, making sibling marriages a safe and practical solution for the growth of humanity. This brings us to an important theological point. God's original design was for a world without sin, death, or decay. When sin entered the world through Adam and Eve's disobedience, it introduced a cascade of consequences that would impact every aspect of creation, including human genetics. Over time, as sin continued to corrupt, the human genome became increasingly flawed. This gradual deterioration eventually necessitated the prohibition of close relative marriages, as outlined in the Mosaic Law, Leviticus 18. But in the beginning, this was not so. It's essential to remember that the early days of humanity were a time of divine exception, a period when God's direct intervention and humanity's unique circumstances allowed for things that would later become prohibited. In this sense, sibling marriages were not a moral failure but a practical necessity, rooted in the perfection of God's original creation. Another layer to consider is the theological significance of these early unions. Marriage, as defined in the Bible, is not merely a social contract but a sacred covenant designed to reflect God's relationship with his people. In the earliest days, the primary purpose of marriage was to fulfill God's command to be fruitful and multiply, Genesis 1 verse 28. This divine directive took precedence over modern notions of romantic love or societal norms. It's also worth exploring how these early practices align with the broader narrative of Scripture. Throughout the Bible, we see examples of God accommodating human limitations while working toward his ultimate purposes. For instance, the laws given to Israel through Moses were tailored to their specific historical and cultural context. Similarly, the sibling marriages of early humanity were a temporary provision, allowed by God to achieve His plan for populating the earth. To fully appreciate this, we must also consider the difference between descriptive and prescriptive texts in the Bible. Descriptive texts tell us what happened, while prescriptive texts tell us what we should do. The accounts of sibling marriages in Genesis are descriptive, providing a historical record rather than a moral endorsement. They reveal how God worked through the unique circumstances of the time to accomplish His purposes. At this point, you might wonder, if God is all-powerful, why didn't He create more people from the start? Why begin with just one couple and their children? These questions touch on the mystery of God's plans, which often surpass our understanding. However, one possible explanation is that starting with a single family emphasizes the interconnectedness of humanity. By tracing our origins back to Adam and Eve, we're reminded of our shared identity as God's creation, united in purpose and destiny. Another intriguing aspect to consider is the gradual revelation of God's will throughout history. As humanity grew and societies developed, God's laws became more specific and tailored to their needs. The prohibition against incest in Leviticus, for example, reflects both the increased risk of genetic defects and the growing moral awareness of God's people. This progression demonstrates how God's guidance evolves to address the changing realities of human existence. Finally, let's reflect on the broader implications of these early unions. They challenge us to think beyond our modern assumptions and consider the historical and cultural contexts in which the Bible was written. They remind us that God's ways are higher than our ways, and His plans often unfold in ways we can't fully comprehend. To fully grasp the complexity of sibling marriages in the early days of humanity, we need to delve deeper into the cultural and moral shifts that occurred before and after the fall. The Bible portrays two starkly different realities, one before sin entered the world and one after it. Understanding this contrast is critical to seeing how God's plans unfolded in an ever-changing moral and cultural landscape. Before the fall, the world was a reflection of God's perfect will. Creation was very good, Genesis 1 verse 31, unmarred by sin or corruption. In this idyllic state, Adam and Eve enjoyed an intimate relationship with God, living in harmony with each other and the world around them. Their actions were guided by innocence rather than rules, as there was no sin to regulate. Concepts like guilt, shame, and immorality simply didn't exist. Marriage, in this sinless context, was a divine institution meant to reflect God's unity and creativity. The union of Adam and Eve wasn't just about companionship, it was a sacred partnership with the purpose of fulfilling God's command to be fruitful and multiply. This original purpose set the tone for the marriages of their children, which were viewed as a continuation of God's creative work rather than a moral dilemma. However, the fall changed everything. When Adam and Eve disobeyed God by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, sin entered the world, bringing with it corruption, death, and a broken relationship between humanity and God. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching, affecting not only Adam and Eve but all of creation. One of the most striking changes was the introduction of shame. Before the fall, Adam and Eve were naked and unashamed, Genesis 2 verse 25, but after their disobedience, they felt the need to cover themselves, Genesis 3 verse 7. This newfound awareness of their bodies and their actions marked the beginning of humanity's moral consciousness, a recognition of right and wrong that would shape the course of history. As sin spread, so did its effects on human relationships. What was once pure and harmonious became complicated and fraught with conflict. The story of Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's firstborn sons, illustrates this point vividly. Cain's jealousy and eventual murder of his brother highlight how quickly sin corrupted the human heart and distorted relationships. This growing corruption also impacted cultural norms. In the centuries that followed, humanity's understanding of morality evolved in response to the increasing complexity of life in a fallen world. As societies formed and expanded, they developed laws and customs to regulate behavior and maintain order. Many of these laws reflected God's desire for justice and righteousness, while others were shaped by human traditions and needs. One key example of this evolution is the prohibition of incest in the Mosaic Law. By the time of Moses, the effects of sin and genetic corruption had compounded to the point where close relative marriages were no longer viable. These relationships were not only morally problematic but also posed significant health risks. The laws given to the Israelites in Leviticus reflect this reality, prohibiting incestuous unions as part of God's broader plan to set his people apart as a holy nation. But why did God allow sibling marriages in the beginning and prohibit them later? The answer lies in his ability to adapt his guidance to humanity's changing circumstances. Before the fall, there was no need for detailed rules because sin hadn't yet corrupted the world. After the fall, God began to reveal his will through laws and commandments that addressed the specific challenges of life in a fallen world. This adaptability is a testament to God's grace and wisdom. Rather than imposing rigid rules that ignored humanity's context, he provided guidance that was both relevant and redemptive. By prohibiting incest in later generations, God was protecting his people from physical harm and moral decay while also pointing them toward a higher standard of holiness. It's also important to note that God's laws were not arbitrary but deeply rooted in his character. The moral principles behind the prohibition of incest, respect for the sanctity of family, the protection of vulnerable individuals, and the pursuit of holiness, are consistent with God's nature and purposes. These principles remain relevant today, even though the specific circumstances have changed. As we reflect on the contrast between life before and after the fall, we're reminded of the profound impact of sin on every aspect of creation. What was once perfect and harmonious became flawed and fractured, requiring God's intervention to restore what was lost. The journey from innocence to moral awareness, from sibling marriages to the Mosaic Law, illustrates how God's plans are both unchanging in purpose and adaptable in execution. The story of humanity's beginnings, as recorded in the Bible, is not just a collection of historical accounts, it's a part of a much larger narrative woven by God himself. From the creation of Adam and Eve to the marriages of their children and the subsequent growth of the human race, every detail points to a divine purpose, the redemption and restoration of humanity. Understanding this greater purpose sheds light on why sibling marriages were permitted in the early days and how they fit into God's overarching plan. First, it's essential to recognize that God's plan for humanity has always been relational. From the very beginning, his design was for people to live in connection with him and with each other. The concept of family was central to this design, as it provided the framework for love, support, and the continuation of life. Adam and Eve's union was the first expression of this divine design, and their children's marriages continued the process of building a relationally interconnected humanity. The first families weren't just expanding the human population, they were setting the foundation for society itself. Each new generation carried with it the Imago Dei, the image of God, and the responsibility to reflect his character in their relationships and actions. This divine image endowed humanity with intrinsic value and a unique role in God's creation. By populating the earth, Adam and Eve's descendants were fulfilling God's command to be fruitful and multiply, Genesis 1 verse 28, a mandate that underscored the sanctity of human life and the importance of community. However, the marriages among Adam and Eve's children weren't merely about physical procreation, they were part of God's redemptive narrative. Even as sin entered the world and began to corrupt human relationships, God's plan to redeem and restore humanity remained intact. Each generation brought humanity closer to the fulfillment of this plan, as seen in the genealogies that lead to key figures like Noah, Abraham, and ultimately Jesus Christ. Theologically, the marriages within the first family can be seen as a symbol of unity and continuity. They remind us that humanity shares a common origin and a shared destiny. Despite our differences in culture, language, and geography, we are all part of the same family tree, a reality that underscores the importance of love, compassion, and reconciliation in our relationships. This unity is particularly evident in the genealogy of Jesus, which traces his lineage back to Adam through figures like Seth, Noah, and Abraham. Each name in this lineage represents a chapter in God's redemptive story, showing how he worked through imperfect people to bring about his perfect plan. By permitting sibling marriages in the early days, God ensured the continuity of this lineage, paving the way for the arrival of the Messiah who would redeem all of humanity. But why was it so important for humanity to grow and multiply in those early days? The answer lies in God's desire for his creation to reflect his glory. Each human being is a testament to God's creativity and love, a living reminder of his image and purpose. By filling the earth with people, God was filling it with reflections of himself, unique, diverse, and deeply loved. At the same time, the growth of humanity was necessary for the fulfillment of God's promises. Throughout the Bible, we see God making covenants with individuals and families, promising blessings, protection, and a future. These covenants often had a generational component, requiring the continuation of a family line. The marriages among Adam and Eve's children ensured that these promises could be fulfilled, laying the groundwork for the covenantal relationships that would shape biblical history. For example, consider the covenant God made with Abraham, in which he promised to make him the father of many nations, Genesis 17 verses 4-5. This promise was contingent on the growth of Abraham's family, which, in turn, was made possible by the foundational work of the first families. Without the early expansion of humanity, the line of Abraham, and by extension, the line of Jesus, would not have been possible. God's greater purpose also includes the restoration of relationships that were broken by sin. The early days of humanity were marked by both unity and conflict, as seen in the story of Cain and Abel. Yet even in the midst of human failure, God's plan remained focused on reconciliation. Through Jesus, who came from the very lineage established by those early marriages, God provided a way for humanity to be reconciled to him and to one another. It's worth noting that God's purposes often transcend human understanding. What may seem controversial or confusing from a modern perspective can make perfect sense when viewed through the lens of God's eternal plan. The marriages between Adam and Eve's children, while perplexing by today's standards, were a necessary part of God's strategy to bring about redemption and restoration. Finally, the story of the first families reminds us of God's sovereignty and faithfulness. Despite humanity's flaws and failures, God has never abandoned his creation. Instead, he has worked through the messiness of human history to accomplish his purposes. The fact that he used sibling marriages to populate the earth and establish the foundation for his redemptive plan shows his ability to bring good out of even the most challenging circumstances. As we reflect on the greater purpose in God's plan, we're reminded of the incredible lengths to which he has gone to redeem humanity. From the creation of Adam and Eve to the birth of Jesus, every detail of the biblical narrative points to his love, wisdom, and sovereignty. The story of sibling marriages in the early days of humanity is just one chapter in this grand narrative, a chapter that reveals God's commitment to his creation and his desire for a restored relationship with his people. As we delve into the complex history of humanity's origins, it's essential to recognize that the lessons from the early days of the Bible offer invaluable insights for our lives today. The way we interpret ancient events, especially those that seem strange or controversial, directly impacts how we view not only the past but also our present and future. One of the biggest challenges in understanding ancient texts, especially in relation to topics like sibling marriages, is how easily we can fall into the trap of judging the past through the lens of modern values. In a world where we constantly confront debates over cultural norms, historical practices, and evolving ethical standards, it's important to approach these subjects with a mindset that allows for growth and understanding. So, how can we apply the lessons of the early days of humanity to reduce our prejudices and expand our understanding today? The tendency to judge past events by today's moral and cultural standards is known as presentism, and it's a pervasive issue. When we look at the actions of Adam and Eve's children, we might be shocked or uncomfortable with the idea of sibling marriages. We live in a world where such relationships are viewed as taboo or even immoral. However, projecting our current views onto ancient practices doesn't give us an accurate understanding of their historical, cultural, and religious contexts. In the ancient world, cultural norms were vastly different from ours. The survival of humanity depended on the rapid multiplication of the population, which in turn required certain practices that we might find uncomfortable today. The same rules that guide our understanding of ethics and morality today did not necessarily apply to the early days of humanity, when the genetic makeup of the human race was still pure, and the earth was pristine. The Bible doesn't spend a great deal of time explaining why Adam and Eve's children married each other, but it's clear that it was a necessity to populate the earth. The concept of marriage between close relatives wasn't viewed with the same moral lens we apply today. Understanding this helps us overcome the tendency to dismiss or misunderstand biblical events that seem problematic from a contemporary perspective. One of the most powerful ways we can learn from these ancient stories is by gaining a deeper appreciation of the historical and cultural context in which they occurred. Instead of focusing on what seems morally unacceptable to modern sensibilities, we can learn to interpret these actions based on the knowledge of the time. Consider how much our own cultural norms have changed over the last century. What was once acceptable in the past, such as societal roles, traditions, or even laws, can seem outdated or even wrong today. We see this in the evolving views on gender equality, racial justice, and various other issues. In the same way, the norms surrounding marriage and family in ancient times were different from what we know today, and understanding this is key to interpreting these events accurately. If we look at the Bible from a purely historical perspective, we can recognize that God's plan for humanity has always been unfolding in a context that is far beyond our own time. He worked with people where they were, sometimes through what we might consider unconventional methods, to fulfill his divine purpose. Understanding this broader context allows us to interpret God's word more fully and see his wisdom even in practices that seem puzzling to us. The stories of Adam, Eve, and their children aren't just ancient tales with no bearing on our modern lives. They carry timeless lessons about God's faithfulness, human relationships, and the unfolding of his redemptive plan. By approaching these stories with humility and openness, we can extract wisdom that transcends cultural and temporal boundaries. For example, the story of Adam and Eve is not just about sibling marriages, it's about the beginning of human relationships, the introduction of sin into the world, and God's plan for redemption. Similarly, the early marriage practices of their children were part of a larger narrative that demonstrated God's continued faithfulness to his creation. This broader perspective helps us avoid simplistic judgments and encourages us to think more deeply about the role of these stories in God's plan. The story of the first family can also teach us about the importance of community and continuity. Even in a world that was new and full of uncertainties, Adam and Eve's children were tasked with building relationships and growing the human race. Despite the challenges and imperfections, they worked within the constraints of their time to lay the foundation for a future that would eventually bring forth Jesus Christ. This same concept of growth and continuity applies to our personal lives and relationships today. Just as the first family had to navigate difficult circumstances to fulfill God's plan, we too must be willing to grow, learn, and adapt to our current challenges while remaining faithful to God's greater purpose for us. There's a critical lesson to be learned here, one that applies directly to the way we live today. In a world filled with division, misunderstandings, and judgments, the stories of the early human family offer us a model for compassion, patience, and wisdom. By seeking to understand the historical context and the greater purpose behind these stories, we can break free from the limitations of our own cultural prejudices. These ancient narratives encourage us to embrace a more nuanced understanding of others. Instead of rushing to judgment based on limited information or personal biases, we can learn to listen, reflect, and appreciate the complexity of different perspectives. We may not agree with every practice or belief from the past, but understanding why they existed helps us develop a greater empathy for those who lived through those times. In our personal and social lives, the ability to understand the context behind actions can help us build stronger, more compassionate relationships. Just as God worked through human history to accomplish his plan, we are called to work through the challenges of our own relationships to fulfill his purpose in our lives. Finally, as we reflect on the early days of humanity, it's important to reconsider how we define morality and immorality. Our modern understanding of right and wrong is often shaped by societal norms that may not always align with biblical principles. By learning to see things from God's perspective, we can expand our definition of what is truly moral, focusing on love, justice, and redemption, rather than simply applying modern standards to ancient practices. Understanding the bigger picture of God's plan encourages us to move beyond surface-level judgments and to engage in thoughtful, compassionate conversations about what is truly good and right. This approach opens the door to deeper insights and helps us see God's Word as both timeless and relevant to our modern lives. As you reflect on this, I challenge you to think about how we judge and understand the past. Are we looking at it through the lens of God's larger purpose, or are we simply reacting to what seems strange to us now? The Bible is filled with lessons that can change our lives, but only if we are willing to dig deeper, understand the context, and apply its timeless truths to our lives today. If you found this video insightful, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Let's continue this journey together of learning and growing in understanding. Remember, to truly grasp the full plan of God, we must begin by understanding the roots of our humanity. And as we do, we begin to see more clearly the divine purpose that guides us all. Understanding the first days of humanity is the key to unlocking the larger story of God's redemptive plan for us all.